Hi, I'm John Matthew Fox of Bookfox, and today we are looking at places in your novel where you can shock the reader. And I'm not talking about, scare them. I'm talking about like making their jaw drop, where they're just flabbergasted at the story development. Honestly, if you're not using at least 2 or 3 of these 9 strategies in your book, then you're missing out on an opportunity. And make sure you stick around to watch the last 4, because those are the more advanced techniques. Lastly, there are lots of spoilers ahead, so if I mention a book that you're planning on reading soon, just skip ahead a little bit. The first shock strategy is reversals. A reversal is just significantly changing the direction your story was going in. It's a little bit like making a U-turn in a car. You were going in one direction and suddenly you are flipped and going completely different direction. Now I'm gonna offer you 2 ways to do this in your own story. The first one is a POV reversal. A point of view reversal is just where you write, say, half of the book from one character's point of view, and then you flip and write it from a completely different character's point of view in the second half. And a great example of this would be Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. The first half of the book is narrated by the husband Nick, and then suddenly it switches, and then the second half of the book is revealed by the wife, Amy Dunn. And anytime you switch point of view halfway through a book, there's going to be delicious contradictions between the ways that these 2 characters tell the same story. And in Gone Girl, there are huge differences between the way that the husband tries to explain the absence of the wife and the way that the wife talks about her own absence and why she did it. A second example of a reversal that might be good for your book is a character reversal. A strong example would be from Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. The main character Shugov is trying to survive in a Soviet prison camp, a gulag, and so he's doing everything he can to win food and just make sure he keeps on living. And that's why it's such a huge character reversal when by the end of that story, he ends up giving food away to someone who really needs it. Now, as far as the placement for a reversal, if you're doing a POV reversal, a great place is right in the middle. And if you're doing a character reversal, it can happen anywhere from the middle towards the end. A second great strategy to shock your reader is a surprise. A surprise is just a dramatic event that causes tension in one particular scene, the scene that's happening right now. To continue with our car metaphor, surprise is like driving a car and hitting a pothole. It doesn't necessarily change where you're going, but it's certainly a big bump. In Old Man and the Sea by Hemingway, we have Santiago out in the waters after he's caught his huge marlin, and then, surprise, 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 a shark attacks. And yes, this is very, very surprising, but it doesn't change the fundamental nature of the story like a reversal would. Now, the advantage of using a surprise in your book is that you can use a bunch of surprises. There's no limitation on the number of surprises that you can use. While with something like a reversal, or say the next one we're going to talk about, which is a twist, you really can't get away with more than 1 in a book. I mean, maybe 2, but usually 1. Another advantage of using the technique of surprise is that you can put it anywhere in your book. You can put it at the beginning, you can put it in the middle, you can put it at the end. And by the way, if you want to learn more about the technique of surprise, check out the writing techniques course in Bookfox Academy, which you can buy on its own, or you can get a subscription to all of the Academy. And now it's time for the third strategy of shocking the reader: add a twist. Now, the essence of a twist is fundamentally rejiggering what the reader thinks about everything that's happened so far in the novel. A lot of people mix up surprise and twist, so I want to be very clear. A surprise impacts what you're thinking about this particular moment in the novel, while a twist impacts everything that's happened so far and asks you to reevaluate all of the story. So to continue with our driving metaphor, a twist is like realizing that the map has been upside down this whole time. It changes your entire understanding of the journey. And a great example of this would be Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. At the very end of that book, we realize that the battle simulations that Ender has been running this entire time are actually not simulations, they are real, and he has just committed genocide. What this does is it makes you look at the entire past of the novel and go, oh, they were not seeing if they were good enough, they were actually having them do the dirty work of attacking this other alien race. And I'd also like to point out 2 categories that might be helpful for you in figuring out how to add a twist to your book. One would be identity twists. These are stories like Fight Club, Sixth Sense, or The Usual Suspects. Basically, we don't know the true nature of one of the main characters, but then by the end, we realize it. And a second category that you might find helpful would be story twists. In books like Life of Pi or Atonement, by the end of the story, we realize what we thought was happening, what we thought was the true nature of the story, ends up being not the true nature of the story at all. Now, a little word of caution, you really want to make sure that you limit your book to one twist alone. I find that often readers will get angry if you try to throw in 2 twists, 3 twists. I mean, they start to feel taken advantage of. And as far as where to put a twist, I feel like 95% of the time, a twist happens at the end. Oh, also, if you like this video, please like it, because then that helps me figure out what content to make in the future. And also, please subscribe, because that helps me not feel like I'm wasting my whole life giving advice on YouTube. Now it is time for the 4th way to shock the reader: make a sacrifice. So having a main character die is an extremely powerful event in your story. I actually spent an entire chapter about it in the Linchpin Writer, talking about how to do it well. And I'll put a link to that in the description if you haven't picked up your copy. But what we're talking about right here is just a little bit more specific than this sort of general umbrella category of character deaths. We're talking about when characters sacrifice themselves, when they deliberately kill themselves in order to achieve a greater good. I think these are even more shocking to the reader because they realize that this is a choice that the character is making. It's not something that's being done to them. And I'd just like to point out 2 different ways you can do this. One is with an honorable sacrifice. For an example of this, let's look at Interstellar, when humanity is dying off and they're trying to reach a new planet to preserve the human race. Now, when they're trying to reach that planet, at one point, Cooper has to sacrifice himself and fall into a black hole so Amelia can use the spaceship to actually get to the new planet and continue the human race. But I'd like to point out a second option that you can do in your book, a redemptive sacrifice. Instead of having the protagonist sacrifice, make your antagonist sacrifice. In season 3 of Stranger Things, we have Billy, who's been an absolutely horrible human being. I mean, abusing his sister and hitting on married women who are twice his age. Oh, and don't let me forget, killing people. But at the end, he has a change of heart. He sacrifices himself in order to resist the Mind Flayer and to save his sister. And why a redemptive sacrifice can really work, maybe for your book, is that changes of heart, character changes, are really powerful. And we like to see villains suddenly redeem themselves in a little way by changing at the very end of the story. Now, the 5th strategy to shock your reader is secrets revealed. And I think there are 2 types of secrets that you can use to shock the reader. The first type of secret is characters keeping secrets from other characters, but the reader already knows about them. What this does is it creates a lot of tension because the reader is just waiting for the other characters to find out about it. And a good example of this might be The Reader by Bernard Schlink. Hannah has this huge secret that she is illiterate, and it keeps her from defending herself at this war crimes trial. She would rather admit that she was guilty in the crimes of burning hundreds of people alive rather than admit she can't read or write. And in fact, she even joined the SS in the first place to cover up the fact that she was illiterate. And a second good way that you can use secrets well in your book is to have characters keeping secrets from the reader. There's a great novel called We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. The narrator, Maricat, tells us all about this event where a good portion of her family was poisoned and died, but she neglects to tell the reader of her own involvement in this affair until almost the end of the book. And a 6th way that you can shock your reader is to offer backstory trauma. I want you to take a moment and just think of the absolutely most traumatizing backstory that you've ever read in a novel. And maybe leave it in the comments. I think these backstories can be especially shocking when we see how they explain who the character is in the present story. So let's look at A Little Light by Hania Yanagihara. This is not a book that I would recommend to anyone. I think it is honestly one of the most DNF'd books of all time, like world record. Why? Because a large part of this book feels like torture to read. We are wondering why the main character, Jude, engages in so much self-harm. But then when we see his backstory and we see the full picture of what sort of abuse he suffered as a child, then we're like, oh. And trust me, if you haven't read this book, whatever you're thinking right now, it's not even close. Like, why don't you times it by like 1,000? And that's how bad it is. It is brutally shocking. Now, does backstory have to be traumatic in order to be shocking? No. Sometimes just backstory information about how someone previously met someone could just as easily be very shocking to the reader and like make their jaw drop. I think the point of this section is just to convince you that if you are writing backstory, look for a way to surprise the reader with that backstory information. Otherwise, there's not really a purpose to that section of backstory. A 7th way to shock the reader is to include a betrayal. Now, I just want to say that the closer the friend that betrays your character, the more shocking it will be. Betrayals from a stranger are like, I mean, I don't know you, whatever. So your goal is to look for the people who are closest to your character who might betray them. I'm talking about stuff like family members, like mentor characters, or like a best friend. And I want to go over a couple of different types of betrayals that you can have in your story. First example would be an inaction betrayal. Let's look at The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. Amir is good friends with Hassan, but when Amir sees Hassan being assaulted in this alleyway, he does absolutely nothing to stop it, which is sad because Hassan is like the nicest guy ever, the nicest friend ever. And Amir's inaction is such a horrible betrayal of his friend. Another good betrayal that you might use is simply a physical betrayal. In Tarantino's Kill Bill, we have Bill, who is a former lover of the bride, come into a wedding rehearsal, kill absolutely everyone, and then shoot his pregnant former lover in the head. Yeah, that's just a little bit of a betrayal. Or if you want to go to something a little less extreme, but nonetheless very emotionally painful, you can have a verbal betrayal. So in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Edmund ends up being befriended by the White Witch, and she offers him candy, specifically Turkish Delight, for Edmund to betray his brothers and sisters. I mean, it was a stupid decision mainly because Turkish Delight just isn't that good. I don't know whether you've had it, but it's like on the whole hierarchy of candy, like it's at the very bottom. But remember, this was wartime and Edmund probably hadn't had any candy or like a ton of food for quite a while. So probably any candy was like, yes, candy. But later on, when Lucy and Edmund come out of the wardrobe and Lucy tries to tell everyone where they've been and the siblings are like, nah, you're making this up. Edmund has a chance to back her up, but instead he says, oh, you're right. We were just playing make-believe. Oh, knife. Twist. And Lucy is absolutely devastated by this betrayal. Now, an eighth way to shock the reader is through hidden relationships. It's usually a good idea in your story to make characters be related in a way that we totally didn't expect. And I will say that the more time that they spend together before the big reveal, the more shocking it is. An obvious example would be in Star Wars between Luke and Leia, right? And surprise, they're actually siblings. They're actually twins. And then they discover who their father is. So there's a bunch of family relationships that are hidden and then come to light in that series. A more recent example is in Percival Everett's book James, which is a retelling of the story of Huck Finn. In James, there's a big departure from the Mark Twain version of the story, where it's revealed that Jim is actually Huck's father. It's truly a shocking moment, particularly because everyone who knows the source material knows that this wasn't part of the story at all previously. But this reveal of a hidden blood relationship makes sense for a few reasons. One, it explains why Jim is out there looking after Huck, like paying attention to him and trying to make sure he's safe. It's also really good because it makes Huck totally reevaluate his whole identity. Like he thought of himself as a white person, now he's like, I guess I'm mixed race. And third, I think it's a great way to comment on the social mores of that time and how they were thinking in binary as black and white. But I think what Everett's pointing out is that there are a lot more complex racial categories than that. And for mixed race people, it's not so easy to put them in one camp or the other. The ninth and final way to shock the reader is desecration. What is the most valuable thing in your novel? It could be a very sacred object. It could be a very sacred place. It could be a very sacred person. And now I want you to think of what is the absolute worst thing that can happen to this object, place, or person. Because if you spent the whole novel building up how important this object or place or person is, and then something absolutely terrible happens to it, your reader's gonna be shocked. In Umberto Eco's wonderful novel, The Name of the Rose, we have a bunch of monks working in a monastery, and a large part of their job is copying all of these ancient manuscripts to make sure copies survive. Books occupy such a sacred spot in their lives and in their work. And then the library burns. And it's even worse than that because someone deliberately set the library on fire. All of their life's work, actually hundreds of years of work of monks, is completely destroyed. I think when I was reading this, I actually said like, oh crap, out loud. It physically pained me to read. I'm not joking here. There was a visceral reaction in my body. And it's probably because, you know, I like books. I mean, See, I mean, these are like, that's half of my books. I like physical books, but you have to determine for your novel what is the most sacred thing that might be harmed that would shock the reader. One last example is Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. This is when Anakin Skywalker kills all the younglings at the Jedi Temple. This hits a couple of sacred cows. One, it's a temple, which means it's a sacred place. Two, it's children who are often considered sacred. And then three, these are not just children, but also members of a sacred sect, the Jedi, which is an additional level of being sacred. So because of those three levels of sacredness, it's just truly a shocking event. Okay, go forth, please add a shocking event to your novel in some way. I think your readers will be pleasantly surprised or horrified by it, but in the end, I think it'll make your book better.